Here's a scene you'll recognise. It's Monday morning and you're staring at the weekly status report template. Your team spent hours over the weekend updating spreadsheets, colour-coding progress indicators and crafting narrative summaries. You'll spend the next 2 hours in meetings hearing those same updates presented verbally. By Wednesday, most of what was reported will be outdated. And here's the uncomfortable question. If we stopped doing all of this reporting tomorrow, what decisions would we actually make differently? For most organisations, the honest answer is not many. Yet we cannot seem to stop. We create ever more elaborate dashboards, we implement new reporting tools, we add reporting layers, and somehow it still feels like waste, compliance theatre rather than value creation. So what's happening here? Why do we invest so heavily in something that often produces so little? The answer is both simpler and more complex than you might think. We don't actually know what job our reporting is supposed to be doing. We've conflated 5 or 6 completely different jobs into one undifferentiated activity called reporting, and then we're surprised when it doesn't work well for any of them. Strategic progress tracking needs one approach. Operational health monitoring needs another. Enabling initiatives and building organisational capability such as experimentation culture or psychological safety requires a third. Projects need a fourth. Yet all of this sits within a cultural and psychological context that determines whether people report honestly or just report what makes them look good. When you mix all these together, you get reporting systems that serve none of those purposes well. A note on format: what you're hearing is the synthesis of experts' published research and frameworks. We've worked to represent those ideas accurately whilst translating them to your specific context, that is, a CEO trying to build the organisational capabilities that will enable growth. The 3 researchers we're going to explore have studied different aspects of what reporting actually does. Michael Norton from Harvard Business School on the psychology of reporting rituals, Douglas Hubbard on what we should actually be measuring and why, and of course Amy Edmondson, also from Harvard, on what your reporting system reveals about your organisational culture. This isn't a technical conversation about dashboards or tools. This is about understanding the fundamental jobs that reporting does, both the obvious ones we talk about and the hidden psychological and social functions that we rarely acknowledge, so you can design systems that actually serve those purposes. So let's start with a question that most organisations never ask. Why do we create reporting rituals in the first place, and what psychological needs are they actually serving? According to Norton's research, reporting is fundamentally a ritual. And understanding it as a ritual explains why it persists even when it seems inefficient and why it can't simply be eliminated or optimised away. Norton defines rituals as having 3 elements. There's a physical component, so the specific words or actions, a communal component that we do it together at the same time, and a psychological component. It feels symbolically meaningful to do it in this specific way. And weekly status meetings check all 3 boxes. There's that physical element. We gather, we present slides, we update colour-coded spreadsheets. There's the communal element, the same people, the same time, the same place. And that psychological element. Over time, this becomes the how we do things around here. The research shows that rituals serve profound psychological functions even when the participants initially resist them. In studies Norton and colleagues conducted, they found that group rituals enhanced the meaning people found in their work, not immediately but over time. Norton explains it's not that we do rituals and then magically we like doing our work later that day. It's that over time the rituals themselves become meaningful to us, a sense of this is how we do things around here. And that meaning is then linked to finding more meaning in the work that we do. This is why simply eliminating reporting meetings will often backfire. You're not just removing an information sharing mechanism, you're removing a ritual that provided psychological stability, a created shared identity, and helped people feel that their work mattered. But then here's where it gets more complex. Norton's research also reveals that not all rituals are equally meaningful. Rituals that feel imposed or purely performative don't create the same sense of meaning as rituals that feel authentic to the group. The weekly status meeting where everyone reads pre-written updates that nobody will remember, that's a ritual without meaning. It checks the structural boxes but fails the psychological function. Norton identifies what makes rituals meaningful versus merely bureaucratic. Meaningful rituals have genuine communal elements. People are actually connecting. They're not just broadcasting information. They have psychological resonance. Participants feel the ritual matters even if they initially thought it was silly. And crucially, they emerge at least partly from the group itself rather than being purely top-down mandates. Applied to reporting, your weekly OKR check-in where people actually talk about what they're struggling with, where the group helps each other solve problems, where there's psychological safety to be honest, that's a meaningful ritual. Your monthly PowerPoint presentation to executives where everyone performs with confidence, they don't feel, hides problems until they're too big to hide. That's a ritual without meaning. Same structural elements, but completely different psychological functions. Norton's framework also explains why reporting rituals are particularly important during organisational change. Rituals provide stability and predictability during uncertainty. When growth has stalled and a new CEO is trying to restart the engine, the familiar rhythm of weekly check-ins can be comforting, as long as they serve a genuine purpose beyond just maintaining the ritual. But here's the crucial insight for those growth mandate CEOs. Norton's research shows that rituals can be redesigned to be more meaningful without being eliminated. You observe what teams are already doing naturally. How do they actually start the meetings? What do they talk about informally? You can codify the good parts while eliminating the performative parts. An example, some teams naturally start meetings by sharing one thing that they learned that week or a problem that they're facing. When that becomes the ritual opening, not because it was mandated, but because it emerged from the group, it serves both the information sharing function and the psychological function of creating connection and shared purpose. Norton's work reveals that reporting isn't just about an information flow, it's about creating organisational identity, providing stability through predictable rhythms, and helping people feel that their work connects to something larger. When CEOs say our reporting feels like waste, they're often right that the information sharing function isn't working, but the ritual function might be working perfectly, and that is why people resist eliminating it. The question isn't how do we eliminate wasteful reporting? The question is how do we preserve the valuable ritual functions while dramatically improving the information and the decision-making function? This requires understanding of what we should actually be measuring and why, which brings us to a very different kind of expert. Norton's insight fundamentally reframes that reporting problem. We've been treating it as a purely information flow challenge, when it's actually a ritual with deep psychological and social function. That's why just make reporting more efficient fails. You can't optimize away something that's serving hidden psychological needs around stability and meaning and identity. But acknowledging that reporting is ritual does not excuse it from being useful. The best rituals serve both psychological and practical functions. Religious rituals create community, but also mark important life transitions. Family rituals create connection and also coordinate complex households. So the question becomes, what should we actually be measuring and reporting on to serve the practical function? Most organisations have never systematically asked this question. They measure the what's easy to measure, or what they've always measured, or what the reporting tool tracks by default. So, Douglas Hubbard's perspectives. Hubbard's research reveals a stunning fact. Approximately 70% of enterprise metrics provide zero decision value. Organisations are drowning in data while starving for actual insight. The problem starts with a fundamental misunderstanding of what measurement actually is. Hubbard defines measurement as an observation that reduces uncertainty about something. Notice what's not in that definition: comprehensiveness, precision, perfection. Measurement is about uncertainty reduction, nothing more, nothing less. So this immediately clarifies what you should measure, things where you have high uncertainty and the decision impact is high. Everything else is waste. Hubbard introduces this critical calculation called value of information. How much would you perfect information on this metric improve your decision multiplied by the probability you'll get actionable information? Most organisation metrics fail this test spectacularly. You are measuring things where you already know the answer, low uncertainty, or where knowing the answer wouldn't change what you do, low decision impact. The classic example that Hubbard gives us? A manufacturing company was meticulously tracking 152 operational metrics with elaborate dashboards and weekly reporting. When Hubbard's team did a value of information analysis, they found that only 8 of those metrics were actually informing decisions. The rest were being tracked because we've always tracked them, or because one day they might be useful. But here's where it gets directly relevant to the growth mandate leader. Hubbard has observed what he calls the strategic operational inversion problem. Organisations typically overmeasure low-impact operational activities while undermeasuring high-impact strategic progress, something we often see when implementing OKRs. You have elaborate dashboards tracking how many meetings were held, how many hours people worked, how many features were shipped, all operational outputs. But you have almost no measurement of whether those activities are actually moving you towards the strategic outcomes that matter. Are we getting closer to a product market fit? Is our new sales notion working? Are we building the capability to move faster? These strategic questions have high uncertainty. You genuinely don't know the answers. And high decision impact. Knowing would fundamentally change your resource allocation. Yet, most companies have no systematic way to measure them. Hubbard's framework reveals why this happens. People confuse hard to measure with impossible to measure. Strategic progress feels fuzzy and qualitative, so organisations default to measuring what's easy, operational activity. But Hubbard's entire career has been built on demonstrating that anything can be measured if you're willing to think creatively about observation methods. So, for example, are we building an experimentation culture? Feels unmeasured. But Hubbard would ask, what would you observe if the culture were changing versus not changing? A style of question we use a lot when helping leaders build metric models and solve these reporting challenges. So you might observe the number of experiments run per quarter, the average time from hypothesis to test result, the percentage of experiments that produce learning regardless of outcome, and the number of intelligent failures are publicly celebrated. Each of those is an observation that reduces uncertainty about whether the culture is actually changing. They're not perfect, they don't capture everything, but they reduce uncertainty, and that's what measurement is. Hubbard also tackles this common CEO fear. If we measure this, people will game the metric. His response? That's a people problem, not a measurement problem. If your culture incentivizes gaming metrics rather than achieving outcomes, you have a much bigger problem than measurement. The solution isn't to avoid measurement, it's to measure the right things, outcomes, not just activity, and create a culture where gaming metrics is more costly than actually improving. Hubbard's framework for building better reporting systems. First, conduct a measurement audit. For every metric that you currently track, ask, what decision would I make differently if I had perfect information on this metric? If the answer is none, or I'm not sure, stop measuring it. You're creating noise, not a signal. Second, identify your highest uncertainty, high impact decisions. These are usually strategic questions, not operational ones. What are you genuinely uncertain about? That if you knew the answer would fundamentally change what you do. Third, design observations that reduce uncertainty on those key questions. Don't aim for perfect measurement, aim for uncertainty reduction. A rough measure of the right thing is infinitely more valuable than a precise measure of the wrong. Fourth, build metric models that show causal relationships, and this is where most organisations completely fail. They track activities and outcomes, but have no model of how activities lead to outcomes. So, do more sales calls lead to more revenue? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on whether you're calling the right measure or how to interpret what you're measuring. Hubbard uses the metaphor of a metrics tree. At the top are ultimate outcomes that you care about: revenue growth, customer retention. Those outcomes are driven by intermediate outputs, qualified leads, or product adoption. Those outputs are driven by activities, sales calls, or feature development. And all of this sits on enablers: team capability, psychological safety, and process efficiency. Most organisations measure leaves on the tree, individual activities, without understanding how those leaves connect to branches, the outputs, or the trunk, the outcomes. So they have no idea which activities actually matter. But if you've been brought in because growth has stalled, something in the causal chain is broken. But if you don't have a metrics model showing the chain, you can't diagnose where the break is, you're just guessing. Hubbard's final insight? The act of building the measurement system, going through the value of information calculation, mapping the causal model, identifying the key uncertainties is often far more valuable than the measurements themselves. The process forces clarity about what you're actually trying to achieve and how you believe that you'll achieve it. When CEOs complain that our reporting feels like waste, Hubbard would ask, have you done the value of information analysis on what you're measuring? And the answer is almost always no. They're measuring what's traditional, what's easy, or what the tool provides, not what actually reduces uncertainty for high-impact decisions. Fix that, and suddenly reporting becomes genuinely valuable. Hubbard's framework is devastating in its clarity. 70% of what most organisations measure provides zero decision value. Think about that for a moment. 70% of the time that your team spends creating reports, updating dashboards, and presenting metrics is producing information that will not change a single decision. The culprit is the strategic operational inversion. We overmeasure low-impact operational activities because they're easy to measure, and we undermeasure high-impact strategic progress because it's hard to measure. But Hubbard's framework gives us a way out. Value of information analysis and metrics modelling. Measure what reduces uncertainty for high-impact decisions. Build causal models that show how activities lead to outputs, which lead to outcomes. Stop measuring everything else. And here's where this gets even more interesting. Even if you fix what you're measuring, your reporting system will probably still fail if people don't feel safe reporting honestly. If everything's green until suddenly red, you have a culture problem that no amount of better metric will solve. Amy Edmondson's decades of research on psychological safety reveals something counterintuitive. High-performing teams report more problems, not less. If your reporting system shows that everything is running smoothly, you likely have one or two situations. Either you've achieved such extraordinary execution that problems genuinely don't exist, rare, or people don't feel safe reporting problems until they are impossible to hide, more common. Edmondson defines psychological safety as a belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, so specifically that you can speak up with questions, concerns, mistakes, or half-formed ideas without being humiliated, marginalised, or punished. In reporting context, this translates to, can I report that my project is behind schedule, that our key assumptions were wrong, and that I've made a mistake without facing negative consequence? Her research, spanning over 2 decades, demonstrates that psychological safety is the foundation of high-performing teams. In her famous study of medical errors, Edmondson found that the best hospital units reported higher error rates than underperforming units, not because they made more mistakes, but because they felt safe acknowledging them. Poor-performing units were making just as many errors, they just didn't report them. The same pattern shows up in every organisational context. Teams with high psychological safety surface those problems early when they're small and fixable. Teams with low psychological safety hide problems until they become crisis. In reporting terms, does your weekly status report show 5 projects as green, 2 as yellow, and none as red until one suddenly shifts from green to red? That's low psychological safety. Does your report show honest assessment? We're yellow because we discovered our core assumption was wrong and we're testing a new approach. High psychological safety. Edmondson's framework identifies 4 organisational zones that are based on 2 dimensions: psychological safety and accountability. The apathy zone, where low safety and low accountability, i.e. nobody cares what gets reported because nothing matters. Reporting is pure compliance theatre. The anxiety zone, low safety and high accountability. People are held accountable for results, but they don't feel safe reporting problems. This produces the everything's green until it's red reporting. People hide issues until they can no longer be hidden. The comfort zone, high safety, low accountability. People feel safe reporting anything because there are no consequences for performance. Reporting becomes confession without improvement. And then the learning zone, high safety, high accountability. People feel safe reporting problems and are held accountable for outcomes, and this is where high performance happens. For growth mandate CEOs, this framework is crucial. You've been brought in to restart stalled growth, which means that you need to diagnose what's actually not working. But if your organisation is in the anxiety zone, your reporting system will actively hide the truth from you. Everyone will tell you that everything is fine until it obviously isn't. Edmondson's research identified specific leader behaviours that create psychological safety in reporting context. First, frame the work as learning problems, not execution problems. When you say we need to figure out why growth stalled, you're inviting inquiry. When you say we need to hit these numbers, you're inviting performance anxiety. And both are necessary, but the learning frame must come first. Second, acknowledge your own fallibility explicitly. Edmondson found that leaders who said things like, I might miss something, I need to hear from you, created dramatically more psychological safety than leaders who projected certainty. In reporting context, this means my job is to make good decisions and I need accurate information in order to do that. I'd rather hear bad news early when we can do something about it than when it's too late and we can't. Third, ask genuine questions, not rhetorical questions that communicate disappointment. Really? We're behind schedule? But genuine curiosity questions. What did we learn that changed our timeline? What do we now know that we didn't know before? Fourth, respond productively to bad news, and this is where most leaders fail. Someone reports a problem honestly, and the leader's reaction, even when unintentional, communicates a disappointment or frustration. Edmondson's research is clear. You get what you reward. If you want honest reporting, you must reward honesty, even when the news is bad. The framework that Edmondson uses distinguishes between preventable failure, complex failures, and intelligent failures. Preventable failures, someone didn't follow a known process, deserve accountability and process improvement. Complex failures, the system breakdown despite following process, deserve systemic analysis and not individual blame. Intelligent failures that are experiments or tests that just didn't work deserve celebration because you've learned something valuable. When reporting systems don't make these distinctions, everything gets treated as a preventable failure. So people hide these complex failures and intelligent failures because they fear being blamed, and then you'll never learn what's actually not working. And for you, this has specific implication. Your reporting system should make it easy, expected even, to report. We tested this assumption and it was wrong. Here's what we learned. This initiative isn't producing the outcomes we hoped. Here's our hypothesis about why. We're behind schedule because we discovered that we were solving the wrong problem, and here's what we're solving now. These are not reporting failures, these are reporting successes. They represent learning, adaptation, and honest assessment. But in low psychological safe environments, these statements feel dangerous to say out loud. Edmondson's framework also addresses a common CEO concern. If I create high psychological safety, will standards drop? Won't people use it as an excuse for poor performance? Her research is unambiguous. High psychologically safe combined with low accountability does produce the comfort zone. Lots of talking, little improvement. But high psychological safety combined with high accountability produces the learning zone, the highest performing quadrant. The key is making the distinction clear. You are safe reporting problems, admitting mistakes, and sharing concerns. You are not safe from accountability for outcomes. In fact, because problems surface earlier in high psychological safety environments, you typically have more time to fix them, which leads to better outcome. So here's how this shows up in reporting. In low psychological safe, projects are green until they're obviously failing, at which some point someone gets blamed. In high psychological safety, projects shift from green to yellow early when assumptions change, giving everyone the time to course correct before it becomes a crisis. Edmondson's final insight: the reporting system itself signals the culture. What you ask people to report, how you respond when they report it, and what gets rewarded and what gets punished, all of this communicates what is actually valued. If your reporting template has a field for risks and concerns, but that field is always empty, you don't have an honest reporting system. If your weekly meeting format allows no time for problem discussion, only status broadcasting, you are signalling that problems should stay hidden. If you want to diagnose why growth has stalled, this is fundamental. Your reporting system might be your biggest obstacle to truth-telling. And without truth, you cannot diagnose problem. Without diagnosis, you cannot fix what is broken. The work of building psychological safety into reporting isn't separate from improving reporting. It's the foundation that makes every other improvement possible. So let's connect these three perspectives. Norton taught us that reporting is ritual. It serves psychological function around stability, identity, and meaning that we ignore at our peril. Hubbard taught us that most of what we measure provides zero decision value, and we need systematic frameworks to identify what actually matters. Edmondson teaches us that even perfect metrics will fail if people don't feel safe reporting honestly. Together, they reveal why reporting feels like waste in most organisations. We're performing rituals that don't serve a practical purpose. We're measuring things that don't inform decisions and operating in cultures where honest reporting can feel risky. But they also show us the path forward. So let's synthesize this into a framework that you can use starting this week. Different jobs need different reporting approaches. So strategic progress. Your OKRs. Consistent with the way that we implement OKRs, this needs both metrics and narrative. You are measuring outcomes that you're trying to achieve, but you're just as interested in the learning and the assumptions that have changed or what you've discovered or what you do differently. Weekly check-ins focus on confidence levels and learnings, not just numbers. Quarterly reviews should celebrate pivots and honest assessments as much as achievement. The ritual function: this is where leadership models learning and adaptation. Enabling initiatives: when you're building organisational capabilities like an experimentation culture, psychological safety, and meeting effectiveness, you need metrics that prove capability is being built. Number of experiments run, time to learn, hours saved, problems surfaced early. These initiatives succeed when the capability becomes self-sustaining, not when the project is complete. These too can become OKRs. The ritual function: this is where you celebrate cultural evolution and capability building. Operational health is your KPIs. So this should be automated, dashboard-driven, exception-based. If the systems are functioning normally, no narrative is needed. Only investigate when something goes outside of a normal range. The ritual function is minimal here. You're not trying to create meaning or identity through operational dashboards. You're monitoring for exception. Projects are time-bound efforts that need lightweight reporting focused on blockers and decisions needed. Weekly updates should take minutes, not hours. The ritual function: quick coordination, remove obstacles, maintain momentum. Incentives: what gets measured gets gained, unless what gets rewarded is genuine outcome and not manipulated metrics. Compensation should tie to strategic outcomes, i.e. OKRs, not operational activity, in addition to operational health and personal performance. Recognition should celebrate desirable high-performing behaviours like truth-telling, early problem-solving, and learning velocity, not just hitting targets. So here's what changes when you apply this framework. You stop conflating these different jobs into one undifferentiated reporting activity. You design layers to serve specific purposes. You preserve the valuable ritual functions: stability, meaning-making, and identity creation, while dramatically improving decision-making and learning. You conduct Hubbard's value of information analysis on everything you're currently measuring. 70% are going to fail the test. Stop measuring those things. Focus your energy on the high uncertainty, high impact questions that actually drive decisions. You actively build Edmondson's psychological safety into your reporting rituals. You frame work as learning, acknowledge your own fallibility, ask genuine questions, and respond productively to bad news. Distinguish between preventable failures, accountability, complex failures, systematic analysis, and intelligent failures, that's celebration. Importantly, you recognise that great reporting systems are not about comprehensive coverage. They're about learning velocity and decision quality. The question isn't, are we reporting everything? The question is, are we learning fast and deciding well? If reporting serves that purpose and simultaneously serves the ritual functions of creating stability, meaning, identity, it stops feeling like a waste and starts feeling like one of your most valuable organisational systems. So here's a reflection question. What job is your current reporting system actually doing? Not what job you intended it to do, what job is it actually doing? Is it providing psychological stability of ritual while producing information that drives decisions and enables learning? Or is it performing ritual without meaning while measuring things that don't matter, hiding problems until they become crises? If you can answer that honestly, you'll know where to start.